Hey students, Mr. Ish again with another video about CSET. In this one, we're going to talk about 3 tips for better evidence. So to remind you, evidence in CSET is a quote, paraphrase, or summary from a source that clearly and directly supports the claim. So the evidence comes after you've given your claim and you've provided a setup to provide some information about the source, and then it's ready to actually take that quote, that paraphrase, or that summary from the source and put it into your paper to start proving your point. So it looks something like this. So here, our claim, a junk food tax is an ineffective solution because it won't reduce obesity unless taken to extreme measures. And then here we've got our setup. One literature review published in the American Journal of Public Health found that. And here is the evidence. In this case, it's a paraphrase mostly with a small quote at the end, right? So what did the literature review find? It found that a small tax on unhealthy foods is likely to have very negligible impact on obesity rates. In order for a junk food tax to actually reduce obesity, the fees would have to be so large as to no longer be, quote, politically palatable or sustainable. So notice how this evidence is saying the taxes have to get really high in order for them to work, right? And that is a direct support of the claim that they're not going to be effective unless taken to extreme measures. Okay, it's an example of the extreme measures. So this is just an example to illustrate how the evidence, right, is a quote, paraphrase, summary from the source that directly supports the claim of the paragraph. So let's get on to our tips. Tip number 1 is only quote for a good reason. And I know this is a hard one to hear because, in my experience, students love to quote, love to just pull quotes from sources and plop them in their essay because it's a quick way to, meet the page count and use all the sources and that sort of thing. But unfortunately, when your paper is full of, nothing but quotes, then your voice isn't really there anymore. So a lot of times the papers just feel like, it's like a string of quote after quote after quote. And when you look at it, there's only like 6 sentences in there that are actually your words. So only quote for a good reason. And if you're not sure what a good reason is, well, APA actually tells us. According to APA, you should only quote, there's 3 situations when you can quote. Here they are. You should only quote when you're sharing a definition. What does that look like? Well, if your source is defining something, a term that's important, and you want that exact definition so that you and your readers are on the same page, it might look something like this, right? According to Perry, a junk food tax is, quote, any percentage fee added on, yada, 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 right? So we have the definition, okay, that this source is using of this term. Okay, that's a good time to quote because, precise definitions matter so that you can come to terms. The second reason that you can use a quote, according to APA, is when the author's wording is particularly memorable. So if they say something and the words matter to the message, okay, then that's a good time to quote. So if they say something, particularly evocative or using, figurative language or something, and if you were to try to paraphrase it, then you would lose some of the meaning, then that's a good time to quote. So here's an example, right? Congressman Joe Schmo describes such taxes as a, quote, heinous example of government overreach into the everyday lives of everyday people, right? So this is a quote, this is quotable material because it's particularly memorable. He's using, strong evocative language like heinous. Okay, he's got this, very effective structure at the end, right? Overreach into the everyday lives of everyday people, right? So good repetition of words there. So this could be an example, since the author's wording is particularly memorable, that's a good time to quote. Okay, third reason to quote is when you will be responding to the exact words of the source. So if the exact words of the source matter, for example, for your tie-in, maybe you're going to be analyzing the words or refuting the words, then that's a good time to quote. So an example of that, right? Smith identifies a junk food tax as a reasonable response to the ever-growing obesity epidemic, arguing that the government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from their own bad decisions. So we've got some quotes there, and what you're going to see when we read the tie-in is that they are the writer is responding to some of the word choice here. So the problem with Mr. Smith's assertion, however, is that what some consider reasonable, okay, a reasonable response, what some consider reasonable, others consider an infringement. if we justify taxes as a punishment for bad decisions, and that's referencing the quote where he said he has to protect citizens from their own bad decisions, right? If we justify taxes as punishment for bad decisions, then we justify taxes for violent video games, social media, and trying to match stripes with plaid. So this tie-in wouldn't work as well if we didn't have the exact words that the author was using. Okay, so that's a good time to use a quote. So sharing a definition, the author's words are particularly memorable, or you're going to be responding to the exact words of the source. So if it matters for your tie-in, right? So if you aren't using your quote for one of those three reasons, paraphrase it instead. Okay, so when we're writing our rough drafts, we do a lot of quoting just because it's quicker. When you're revising for the final draft, look at all of your quotes and try to identify which of those reasons is it. If it's none of them, paraphrase it. Okay, tip number 2, paraphrase strategically. So students often, in my experience, rush their paraphrasing. And so here are some lists of don'ts, right? Things not to do that often are a result of rushing paraphrasing. Don't paraphrase straight from the source. So don't just try to look at the source and then write the ideas in your paper, okay? Because it's not going to work well. It's going to turn out clunky, awkward, or you're going to be plagiarizing. Don't pick a passage that's too short or too long, right? It's hard to paraphrase 4 words, right? It's hard to put that into your own language. Likewise, it's hard to paraphrase, 2 paragraphs. So because you're just working with too much. So don't pick anything too long or anything too short. And don't just swap out words with the thesaurus, right? So don't just, paraphrasing isn't cutting and pasting and then using your online thesaurus to just swap out, all the nouns. Okay, it's more than that. So what should you do? You should follow a plan for paraphrasing. Okay, this is the plan we've covered in the past. So I'll remind you of it, right? So choose a passage. 1 to 5 sentences is a good length. Okay, choose something from the source with important details for your argument, right? That's when you're paraphrasing. You got important details. You got to put them into your paper, but you can't use the exact words of the author. So 1 to 5 sentences. If it's 1 sentence, probably 1 long sentence, because a short sentence, again, is going to be too short. Okay. But this is a manageable length to work with most of the time. Next, look up any words or references you don't know in order to completely understand the source. So if you're going to turn those 1 to 5 sentences into your own words, you have to know what they're saying. So if there's anything in there that you don't understand, you can't make sense of, right? Look it up, read the other parts around it, right? Figure out what that passage is saying as best as you can before you try to put it into your own words. Next, take fragmented notes on the passage. So when I say fragmented notes, I mean like bullet point notes, right? Try to take some bullet points on a piece of paper or on another screen on the computer, not complete sentences. So that'll help you get away from the wording from the original. Then once you've got your notes all done, cover up the source, okay, or close the tab, or flip the article over if you got it printed out, cover it up and rewrite the passage from your notes. So use your notes to write the passage, right? Write your paraphrase. The goal is to use all of those ideas from the notes and get a little further away from the wording in the notes. So then you're 2 steps removed from the wording of the original. Okay, and then the final step, which a lot of people overlook this, right, is revisit your paraphrases like the next day or maybe, 8 hours later or whatever, a couple days later, and revise your paraphrases to better sound like you. Because what happens when we're following these steps here is sometimes we're so focused on getting away from the original that our wording gets really clunky and awkward and it doesn't sound like us anymore. We lose our voice. We choose some really awkward word choices or transitions. So if you go back to the source your paraphrase the next day, right, and revise it without looking at the source, then you can make your voice come out better. You can make your wording more clear, less awkward, and you can, since you're not looking at the source, right, and it's been like a whole day since you've looked at the source, right, then the odds of you the odds of you plagiarizing are much, much less, right? So you're not going to be tempted to steal the words from the source. So don't do these things and do follow a good strategic plan for paraphrasing. Okay, last tip for evidence is to beef up your research by summarizing a study. So when we were talking about academic journals, we looked at, what a scientific study looks like, and we talked about all the different sections and how some of the sections are more helpful to you than others. So one way to really beef up your research paper And I don't just mean add good details, but also like literally add a lot of words there so you get closer to the page count, but words that are full of good details for your paper, is to summarize a study. So it looks something like this. Okay. Now this could be an entire paragraph, right? If you slap a claim at the top and a tie-in at the bottom, the rest of this is basically the evidence, right? This is the summary. And I broke it into 3 different colors here because there's 3 different parts to this strategy. But it's a really good strategy if you have a source that's a study, because it's relatively easy to follow, and it just adds a lot of good detail. So here's what it looks like. The first thing you do is mention where the study was published or conducted and what they're trying to discover. So look at our first sentence. One study published in the American Journal of Public Health aimed to identify the lessons learned from a tax on sugary drinks that was implemented in Berkeley, California. So where the study was published and what they were trying to discover. Next, what you're going to do is paraphrase the study method. So remember, we talked about studies usually have very distinct sections. One of them is called method. So that's where they say, how many people they surveyed, how many lab rats they injected, so on and so forth. So in this case, this study was interviews. So they say the research team conducted interviews during an almost 2-year span, and then they tell us who they interviewed. And then they also say they analyzed some records. So look at that methods section and summarize the methods of the study in your own words, right? And now your readers have a good idea of what they're trying to discover, how they're trying to discover it. So the final part is to paraphrase the most important findings of the study. And remember, you're usually going to find these in the abstract and in the discussion section. So I won't read all this to you, but right, we can see the study revealed several actions should be taken. We can see that actions are enumerated there. Researchers also discovered that the tax created approximately $9 million of revenue. So we've taken the most important findings of the study, summarize or paraphrase them in our own words. So you do this, right, these 3 parts to your study, and you've got a nice beefy paragraph here. And obviously, this is also going to have a claim, and you'll have some tie-in after it. So there is a good way to get lots of good chunky research into your paper. Okay, summarizing a study. Okay, so that wraps up our tips on evidence to summarize them, right? When you're choosing your evidence, only quote for a good reason, right? If it's not one of those 3 reasons that APA tells you, paraphrase it instead. When you do paraphrase with a plan, right? Don't just look at the source and try to come up with things right off the top of your head right away. Use the strategy. And then finally, consider if you have any sources that are scientific studies, using an extended summary to really beef up your research, to really help support your claim and to boost your own credibility as an author. All right, thanks for watching, students. I will see you in the next video.